Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time for some Star Wars analysis, a movie I haven't gotten around to the full analysis for, even though I've been teasing it for quite a while. How you guys doing? So, it's finally here. Empire Strikes Back, the review and analysis of the second Star Wars movie, which came out way back in 1980. Let's take a look at it because there's a whole lot to talk about with this particular movie. It is a beloved movie, and in a lot of lists, it comes out as the top Star Wars movie, and I think there are some very, very good reasons for that, and I'd like to go ahead and dig into those. So first of all, let's just talk about some general thoughts here. The visual design is, I think, a real high point in this movie, and I'm going to talk about it a lot because I think it really matters. I think the visual design of Star Wars is one of the most important things, in addition to what this movie does really well, which is character drama and character development rather than plot. But the aesthetics and the visual design in particular is extremely important to the Star Wars franchise, and I think this movie, had it not had the incredible visual design that it does have, would not be as well remembered as it is, but also I don't think the Star Wars franchise would be talked about as much as it is. This is the movie that really turned Star Wars into a franchise. It's a middle act to the trilogy, and so as a result, it is a story that's really focused on the characters being in a chaos situation. I've talked about the three-act structure before, that you usually have the first act, which is more getting heroes lined up to do whatever big thing they have to do. In the middle act, they tend to be in a reactive mode. They're on the defensive. They're forced to act and run away, and that's really what we have in this movie. The entire movie is about the heroes having to react and try to prepare to overcome the villains in the third act, which is going to be Return of the Jedi. And this is also important because the middle act of a three-act structure tends to end with a failure of some kind. The hero goes up against the villain, but he doesn't have enough power, or he's misunderstood the nature of the conflict and he's unable to overcome the challenge. And that is the case here. We have a significant failure of the main character in Luke Skywalker before we're able to have him have a triumphant final victory in the third act, which is Return of the Jedi. Aesthetics. I'm going to talk a lot about aesthetics. They're extremely important. So first of all, with this movie, this is the most diverse set of aesthetics settings. That is, the set design, all of that stuff. We have the most amount of diversity of any Star Wars movie until we go to the prequel, so of the original trilogy for sure. We have a snow planet at the beginning, which is very interesting, and we don't really see that again. We have a swamp. We have just the openness of space and all the rocks that exist in space in the asteroid belt. We have a whole bunch of different ship interiors, and we also have this high-tech city, which has its own aesthetic duality as well. So the aesthetics in this communicate elements of the story, and this is something that I've hinted at and I've talked about in other analyses and other videos. Aesthetics have meaning. Aesthetics do not exist in a vacuum. They're not artificial. They're not just a set of preferences for what looks pretty. Aesthetics point to deeper meaning, and I think in the Star Wars canon, if you will, aesthetics really do point to some significant meanings depending on what aesthetics you're talking about and where you're looking. I think in this movie, it really points to the emotional state of where the characters are when they're experiencing these different settings and the aesthetics that are used to create these settings. So for the snow, of course, if you're out in the snow, you're going to think of loneliness, hibernation. It's like Valley Forge. This is the Rebel Army wintering over, if you will, just like the Rebel Army, the Continental Army did back during the American Revolutionary War, having to essentially go into exile and remain in a very, very precarious position for an indeterminate amount of time until they're attacked and they're put on the defensive and they have to run away again. So space also has a very specific feeling to it. You know, in space, there's just a window between you and death. You know, there's very little blocking you from complete annihilation. So when you're on the run in space, there's a constant threat surrounding you of death, there's an emptiness to it. Kind of like in snow, the same thing, there's an emptiness to it, but with space it's even more enhanced. The swamp, you have a feeling of dirtiness all the time. And when you go into the swamp, and when Luke goes into the swamp, the first thing that happens is his ship gets sunk into the swamp, which means he is out in the challenge of the wild. This is like a coming of age trial, if you will. And there's an exile to it. Luke has to go away from his friends, away from the things which give him meaning in order to develop himself as a man. There's an exertion to it. The swamp, of course, literally devours his technology, except for his friend R2-D2, who is able to escape. And through that devouring of his technology, he has to return to the spiritual place of where Yoda's trying to take him, of what the Force really is, who he is as a person on a spiritual level. That's really what his training with Yoda is all about, and the swamp really serves to heighten that. He's in a constant state of exertion, of self-exertion. And then finally, Cloud City. When you get to Cloud City, it is really an urban, almost an impressionistic view of an urban setting. There's this safety to it. There's these clean white halls that are beautiful to look at and are sterile. And then, of course, you also have these scenes of, say, an incinerator where there's this griminess and these aliens burning up old pieces of trash in Cloud City, as well as Luke falling down to the bottom of Cloud City where things just kind of drop off into oblivion. It really is kind of a representation of the mega city, I feel like. A big thing about the aesthetics in this, and this plays really not just into the aesthetic choices, but how those are actually expressed, how they're executed, is the use of high contrast photography. This is the biggest takeaway from the cinematic experience of The Empire Strikes Back as far as visuals go. So the high contrast photography makes the whole film feel a lot more emotional, in some cases more realistic, because we're seeing an image rather than it being completely smoothed out and detailed like we're looking at a painting. It's something more like we're in our own low light area. We only see parts of objects. It's more impressionistic, even as it's more realistic. It's grittier, and of course, there's a little bit of heightened drama there. I've talked about this with comic art before, and specifically the art of John Buscema. John Buscema is a Marvel artist. You probably have seen his work because he's penciled and inked almost every major book that Marvel came out with in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But when you look at his inks, you'll notice that there's these big fields of black and these big fields of white where there's very few lines on a face, and then there's, a real just blackness covering part of the body in the terms of shadow. That's high contrast, meaning there's a strong difference between light and dark. And of course, if you're just doing a black and white comic, like Savage Sword of Conan or something, that's the highest level of contrast you can get, and that's why his drawings tend to have impact. Even when you put colors over them, the inking really makes them pop. It makes them feel more dramatic. It's like you're looking at a representation of an object rather than the object itself. And that approach to photography for The Empire Strikes Back ends up making it feel more real, even as we see less of the details. That is something that I think we'll see. So the lighting effects create an impression of the image rather than the image itself. And we also have an interesting thing in here, which is the use of orange as a emotional color. So in The Empire Strikes Back, we have two main colors. Basically, it could be a film that's entirely in black and white, except for the color orange. The other colors are very, very muted, and they're kind of out of the way. There's the blue of R2-D2. The color blue is very hard to find in The Empire Strikes Back. It's very seemingly out of the way. Even on Dagobah, the swamp, it's mostly gray. It's grays and browns. It's very muted, except for this use of the color orange. And this is similar to the first movie, where you have a kind of a yellow tan, colorless desert. Just kind of like how you have an ice desert in Hoth. And then you have these sterile white hallways from the Empire. Now, they took a different approach with the Empire aesthetics, as we'll see, but this is a big one, is that there's a very limited use of color palettes. Compare this to the prequels, which are very washed with color, and it's quite easy to see a difference in aesthetic approach besides just the different use of technology between the original trilogy and the prequels. The limited color palette, particularly in this movie, I think is very striking. So I give the aesthetics actually a 10 out of 10. That's a perfect score. I can't really think of a movie that's better aesthetically except maybe one that's just on par, which would be like Revenge of the Sith. Revenge of the Sith, that third movie, is just, even though it's far more colorful, it's just really brilliant aesthetically as well. So they do a great job with it. And everything about this, there's always details to discover. Everything feels real about it. And that's a quality of the photography, which I'm just kind of rolling into the aesthetic category for the purpose of this presentation. So here's a couple of screenshots. I have a whole bunch of screenshots because I want to talk about these details. So you can see in the hangar, we have a lot of use of lighting that is overhead, which is realistic lighting. So the Millennium Falcon is mostly muted kind of shapes and not really a strong sense of what's there. And that actually might be a matte painting. I don't entirely remember how they set all this stuff up, but you get a lot of these strong overhead shadows. It makes it feel a lot more real. And this is very appropriate when you don't have close-ups of character faces. You just have, you know, extras, and you have Han kind of walking under an X-Wing. That all works. If you look at the ice cave, even though we're on a white planet, there's a lot of use of darkness, and you notice that we have a little bit of the color blue there to have some sort of shade that's neutral to fill things in. So inside the darkened ice cavern, we have a lot of high contrast as well. We have the bright outside leaking in around dark shapes with Luke. Inside the Rebel base, everything is dark as well. There's very little lighting. In the command room, the lighting is mostly from underneath. You notice this is something that is not often used in movies, and in this case, the team did it to really, really good effect. And there's one more scene where the lighting from underneath has a really strong effect. You see, this is not the way we typically light actors' faces if we want them to look pretty. We usually have two lighting sources, what's called main light and a fill light. In this case, the fill light is stronger than any kind of main light. There is maybe a main light in there somewhere, but we're really doing it underneath. Then you contrast that to the extremely bright outside of the snow. And we can see there's contrast not just within a scene is high contrast, but there's high contrast between scenes, so between visual elements. Let's take a little bit of a look at the revised look of the Empire. The Empire in the first movie is predominantly white and gray, and it has a high contrast look as well. There's blacks. In this one, it's mostly black and gray. The color black becomes much stronger, and of course that's the color of Darth Vader. You can see that he has his weird little, his weird little chamber where he's able to take off his helmet, and you see glimpses of his scarred face. You have white inside and black outside in a darkened room, and there's always this feeling of natural light where there's lots of little light bulbs or lots of little lights all over a set, just giving some ambience to the lighting rather than providing strong lighting like what you'd see in a traditional movie. This bottom image is actually from the interior of the Walker, and you can see there's a couple of stormtroopers with some new costume designs, which are interesting to look at. But we also have this same effect. Everything's kind of black and everything's dark. And we have very, very strong main lighting on the right side of the character's face and very, very weak fill lighting on the left-hand side. This is a more traditional lighting setup, a main light and a fill light. I actually use 3 lights for my setup, by the way, and my main light's directly on. But usually I have a main light slightly off center. In this case, the main light is just really cranked up and there's very little fill, and the fill's mostly there to just make sure that you see all of his face. So the fill lighting in general tends to be either really, really strong or very, very weak to produce that high contrast effect in the photography. Here's some more Empire interiors. We have Darth Vader talking to a couple of holograms, and the bottom image here is from the special edition. There's very little changes in the special edition compared to the other 2 movies in the trilogy, by the way. And this is one which was the revised Emperor scene where they put in, a model of the Emperor that's more accurate to what you'd see in Return of the Jedi. And I think it works. I think it's fine. They revised the dialogue a little bit to make it more clear where they were going to go with Return of the Jedi. The original one had these kind of weird chimpanzee eyes. It's very interesting to look at the original too. But notice that aesthetic is still preserved with the special edition, that dark, dark, dark look. So if you're looking at it on your screen, you may just see just the reflections of Darth Vader's armor, and otherwise it's just blackness moving into the background. And then you see just the lighting on the wall in various places and so many little details. But at the same time, if you were to look at this in bright light, you'd see that the details maybe aren't as precise as you would think. It's the high contrast kind of smooths out the details, makes the details blend into an impression of the whole. Space is another aesthetic I talked about. We have a big, strong contrast with stars and with asteroids in the chase scenes, and we have this great shot of the ships where we have blue on the ship and then this orange burning engines. It just looks really striking. And this is one of the first cases where you have the use of the color orange to kind of pump up emotion. Next, let's take a look at the swamp. Of course, we see the swamp devouring Luke Skywalker's ship. This is not a high contrast frame, but it's a very dark frame. And you notice that there's really no color in it. And when we get to Yoda's place, we start to get color. And if we look at the picture of Yoda, you'll notice that there's a very, very strong backlighting. And the main light, if that's what it is far off to Yoda's left, basically showing you only half of his face, and the other half of his face is shrouded in shadow. I think this is actually one of the reasons why the puppet Yoda in this movie seems so good, and why you see a puppet Yoda, say, in Last Jedi, and he looks so bad, is because the presentation of the puppet, the way that the puppet was shot, with a cinematography style that really hides any kind of flaws there are in the fact that the puppet is not a real living being, and instead just shows the details of what the Frank Oz is really doing with the character. And it gives an impression that he's much more alive than if you were to see him in bright, full light where you're able to see him. And same thing if you look at the original version of The Phantom Menace, they have a Yoda puppet. In that bright light in the Jedi Council, he doesn't look right. It was a good decision to change him to CGI in future versions of it. The CGI Yoda from the prequels just looks better in the lighting style of the prequels, which is full lighting, high detail. In this case, we have this high contrast emotional lighting. And again, the fire is a bit of orange that's bringing in. You notice that we have a lot of backlighting. We have a lot of lighting on the set, which is not something that you always see. Just as an example, on the Millennium Falcon here, we have this scene of Han and Leia trying to have a little moment. And you notice there's light sources in front of them. This is a little bit of an odd thing. A lot of movies would avoid this. And you notice, again, you have the color orange, which is a very interesting little thing there, along with C-3PO being one of the only colorful things that we have on the palette here. But it's all high contrast. You notice there's lighting from above. Instead of having a strong, main fill light, you just have kind of one light off from the side lighting the whole thing, and a light behind C-3PO as well. When we get to Cloud City, we have an aesthetic of bright whiteness that really makes you feel in a sterile and safe environment, like they've reached safety. But Leia in this scene, of course, is saying there's something wrong. We haven't seen C-3PO. Something is wrong going on here. So we have some disturbance among this extremely peaceful setting. So this contrast between the bright white and the darkness of the Millennium Falcon and the space through which they've traveled is apparent. Cloud City itself, when they arrive, has this orange sunset going on. And frequently there's shots out the window, in the special edition at least, where you can see it's sunset again, or you see them flying through the city and it's sunset. You have this orange suffusing it. When we get down to the second half of Cloud City, really the underbelly, we find Chewbacca looking at this incinerator where they're scrapping droids and figuring out what they can take away. And it's a dirty kind of rotten place. That's the underbelly of the city. So even within the city, there's this contrast between something that's pristine and sterile and something which is really dirty. That's where we find C-3PO. And again, notice that there's light sources that the camera's facing. The camera is looking at a light source in that furnace. Whether that was added in post or not, I'm not sure. But it certainly has a really strong effect where we have brightness in the middle and then we have just blackness all around it. It really looks great. It's really a great looking set there if you take a look at it and just take in all the details. And you could take 100 screenshots from this movie and find details that are worth looking at in every single one of them. Next is the use of the color orange in the freezing chamber. Again, we have a really emotional scene between Han and Leia where she says, "I love you," and he says, "I know." And the lighting is not only orange, but the orange is coming from underneath, and the colors in the background are all blue. So there's a high contrast, if you know your color well, between blue and orange. So these are contrasting colors or complementary colors, and that's what they're using on the set. You don't notice the blue so much, but it really is there. It's a blue, slightly blue going to this orange. It's really striking, and the lighting of the faces underneath shows a different emotional side than what you see if you were shooting with full brightness photography. Again, you're only seeing an impression of what Leia's face is. You're missing a lot of details. You can see, the undersides of her brows, but you can't really see her cheeks. You can't see her whole eyes. You can't see her whole mouth, really. You just see impressions of it. It's kind of like looking at an ink drawing, maybe. And when I'm mentioned comic art. Likewise, you have Vader in the background just as a black blur with these bright white splotches on him. Really special, and Boba Fett as well. We have this color used when Luke first meets the Emperor, this color of passion, the orange color, because Luke is full of fear and also anger towards Vader for harming his friends. And Vader is waiting for him in the blue side, which is for Vader, it's actually calm and unemotional. And it's interesting also that we have our lightsabers, the passionate Sith have a red lightsaber, and the more supposed to be less passionate Jedi have blue and green and these other colors. So we also have a lot of high contrast throughout the entire lightsaber duel, one of the really the big climax of the movie. We have, when we finally get out to that bridge, we have this strong contrast between the lightsabers themselves and the characters, which again are lit kind of softly. They're lit at odd angles rather than in a direct way where you can see the details. And it really has a good effect. It's a very, very emotional scene too that we get there. And you can see the entire city kind of going down below it. If you actually go and you watch the movie carefully, you'll see that when Luke is falling, all of the windows are slightly orange as well. So they are not colorless. They actually have a little bit of an orange color to them. So check that out next time that you watch them. Lastly, we have a return to sterility. This is more of that. This is that hospital ship. We get to a white and safe place, kind of a return to civility. And we still have a little bit of dirt there with that droid though. But it's great. It's a great aesthetic. We have them watching this galaxy, which you probably wouldn't actually be able to see a galaxy like that, but it has a good striking visual effect. Again, a light source in the center of the frame. Let's move on. Let's talk about music. Music is mostly development from the previous score, continued use of motives, which are used very effectively. John Williams is a master composer, and he's on full display with this. It's very effective throughout the movie. There's really no criticisms negative of the score other than we're not seeing a ton of new stuff. There's also a lot of use of silence. There's creative use where there's silence allowed to sit in, and there's also a lot of up and down. There's quiet music and there's loud music, and we do have some introduction of some reflective themes during the romance story, which I think have become part of the soundscape of Star Wars over time. So overall, I'll give the music a 9.5 out of 10. It's very effective. There's nothing really to say that's bad about it. The sound design, I think, in this movie actually really shines. There's really, just like there's high contrast in the photography, high contrast in the sound design. We got really loud blasters that just scream. We have the sound of lightsabers hitting together. It just really kind of shocks your ears if you're listening on a full volume system, which is what I usually would recommend this sort of movie to be watched on. Things really squeal. There's a lot of high end when things happen. And we also have this kind of screaming machine sound when we have things breaking, things grinding, really loud squealing sounds when machinery's breaking. There's also a lot of ambience in this movie as far as sound design. There's this windy sound on the ice planet, wind howling inside and outside, kind of pulling you into a cocoon. There's this rumble whenever you're in the interior in a battle. There's this constant rumble that you hear, reminding you that there's a conflict going on outside. There's always these sounds of waters and like fauna and things dripping and little weird alien animals whenever you're out with Yoda. Even the crackle of fire, which is a good touch. And then there's always this hum of machines when you're in the high-tech settings. When you're on the ship, there's always the sound of like the engines droning. In the city, there's always like a constant kind of hum of things going about. It really has a good effect overall. So I think the sound design is great. I give it a 10 out of 10. Probably one of the best classic sound design examples I can think of. A couple of additional thoughts for production. The presentation of Empire Strikes Back is probably, when I say it's the most condensed, I mean it contains the most referential material. It has the most Star Wars in it compared to the other two movies, and it's the most frequently referenced. Think about how packed every scene is with objects, and think about how often we see things that are really replicating Empire Strikes Back. When you go, if you can remember the way Star Tours used to look like in Disneyland, the original Star Tours, it looked like you were walking into Empire Strikes Back, not the other movies, because it was dense, it was junky, it was full of stuff, it was dark, it was really dark inside. So if you go to the new one, it doesn't look quite the same, but the old one really looked that way. The ride also looked, it was high contrast in space, it looked like. It looked like the Empire Strikes Back. And if you go and you watch the new movies, say I'm gonna pick Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, both of these are trying to visually emulate the high contrast style of The Empire Strikes Back. They are using bright colors like red with a limited color palette, but they're not using the same high contrast photography that is used in this one. And one more thing I'll say, if you go and you watch, say, Luke and Vader battling, especially when they come out onto that bridge that's over the city, you'll notice the camera doesn't move. The camera is usually in place, and it's the characters who move into and out of the frame. This is so different from the way they do it in a modern movie, and the way they did it in Force Awakens and Last Jedi with all the shaky cam stuff. Cameras constantly following people around and moving themselves. It's a radically different cinematic style. So if you wanted that high contrast style that this has, you should have looked first at the lighting and not thought, maybe bright red, or let's have the planet be outside at night, those sorts of things. You should have looked first at the photography style, because it really is exceptional, besides just trying to emulate the mannerisms of the aesthetics. Now, this is a good one too. Rather than a lived-in universe, so when we watch the first Star Wars movie, everything seems slightly run down. It's very used, repaired, recycled, there's wires hanging off of everything. Rather than this, we have extremes. We have a sterility of the high tech, which is in the Empire ships, everything is perfect. In Cloud City, everything looks perfect other than the underbelly. And you have that contrasted with the savagery of the wild, the swamp where technology is just eaten alive. The ice planet where you have to ride a living organism, the Tauntaun. You got to ride this weird kangaroo creature because machines won't operate in the cold. All of these things. So you have this extreme contrast between a sterile, very new looking technological environment and really savage environments, whereas the first movie was really about that lived in aesthetic. So it really expands it. I don't think it replaces it, it just expands it. So major developments from the first movie. I think if this movie had not been as good as it is, we wouldn't have a Star Wars franchise. And I think it really does represent the height of production. And I think the quality of this movie stands up just by seeing how little George Lucas actually changed in the special editions. He changed a lot in the first movie, he changed a lot in the third movie. Really didn't change much in The Empire Strikes Back. Just a couple of little things. So overall, it's a 9 out of 10 on production. That's a very high score. Near perfect. let's talk a little bit about the story. So the setting is the first thing I'll talk about. I wouldn't normally talk about this with a lot of different movie analyses, but with Star Wars, the setting is so important. So it massively expanded the Star Wars setting. It changed everything about the way we perceive Star Wars. This empire and this rebellion, there's also things that aren't really associated with either one. We have a real feeling of large spaces and an empire that's kind of going out to find the rebellion. We also really fleshed out the way the Force works. So the Force went from just kind of a magical thing and the perception of Jedi Knights as being like knights to something that's more Eastern inspired, an Eastern inspired philosophy that basically translates into magic. So this idea of controlling your emotions, this dark side, light side thing, most of that really comes from The Empire Strikes Back and the conversations with Yoda and how it expands that, how it kind of sets the boundaries for the Force and expands the boundaries for the Force and pulls the Force into an area where it's both mystic and practiced. You must practice to use the Force. It has to do with your communion with the Force, but it's also something that's mystical and entirely magical, really. And it established a progression of gurus. This is actually part of the story that's important. Yoda taught Obi-Wan, who taught Anakin. Now that gets kind of revised in the prequels, but this idea that Obi-Wan failed and that he wasn't as good a guru to Anakin as Yoda was to him. This is an Eastern thing, the idea of master teaching student, kind of an apostolic progression of teachers, of gurus, and the light side, dark side, of course. We also got to see the Emperor and the military being subservient to the Sith. This wasn't entirely clear in the first movie, as Grand Moff and Darth Vader were somewhat on equal terms. Darth Vader was kind of independent of him, but in this case, we really see that everybody is taking their orders from Darth Vader. Darth Vader is basically the second in command of the entire Empire, and that's what we get to see. We see that the Sith are the ones in charge. Darth Vader's not just like a roving dog, not the Emperor's dog. He is actually an important character, and that's a little bit of a revision from the first movie. We also see the Empire in full force, not as a defeated thing, but of course we understand now it's larger and more powerful than we thought. Of course, it has a fleet of mega ships that are capable of destroying lots of different things. Destroying one battle station, of course, would not destroy the Empire. It just was a setback and destroyed their greatest weapon. So overall, I give the setting, and especially its expansion with the Force, a 9 out of 10. It does a very, very good job. What we're missing is we don't really know what's going on at the heart of the Empire. We haven't seen Coruscant. We don't know about the Imperial planet, that kind of stuff. We get kind of that stuff later, but we can't give 100% of the setting because the main thing about this movie is actually the characters and the dialogue. And I did a whole video on this, why the characters, why people love Empire Strikes Back, and I think a big part of it is the characters. Not just that strong aesthetic value, I think that's a huge part, but the characters. So it has the best character development and the best drama in the series. It has a real exposition of Vader being really evil, really hypes him up as a villain. We have Han and Leia's personalities being expanded, that represent the bad boy and the goody two-shoes. I've talked about them in some videos in the past. And it has a great romance arc. You start with tension between the bad boy and the goody two-shoes, and it develops into romance as they understand and appreciate their respective virtues and come to be attracted strongly to one another. This is also hinted at the beginning. It's like, what about me? That Han thinks that she likes him, but they haven't really figured that out yet. And then there's a tension between Luke and Yoda. There's a strong drama there. Yoda is really worried that Luke can't hack it. Luke is kind of rebelling against Yoda in a way. He just doesn't really want to accept that he's so weak and that he doesn't know what the heck he's doing. So there's a good, strong drama between those two. We have this drama within Luke, Luke's personal journey with his own nature. That's why when he goes into the log, and of course he takes his technology with him. Yoda says, "Your weapons, you will not need them," and he takes them in with him. He takes the technology in with him, and what he sees is Darth Vader, who is also technological. He's a cyborg. Cuts off Darth Vader's face, and he sees himself, and that's how he understands that his nature is ultimately like his father's, and that comes to fruition when his father says, you can destroy the Emperor. He's foreseeing this. Join me, and I'll complete your training, and together we'll destroy the Emperor and rule the galaxy as father and son. And he sees that he's a lot like his father, and this repeats again at the end of Return of the Jedi, but we'll get to that when we talk about Return of the Jedi. There is a little bit of early dialogue between Han and Leia that I mentioned. It's a little bit cheesy. It's a little bit too on the nose. It's to set up the romance plot. So that's my only knock, is some of the early dialogue is a little bit expositional, a little bit stilted. But you have to have some of that if you want your screenplay to be efficient, and you don't want to have to tell the audience too much. You want to still be able to show them. So overall, it's a 9.5 out of 10. This is really to me the strength of the movie, is those character drama elements. Now the plot is not quite as good, but that's not to say the plot is bad. It's just the plot's very loose and the events are rather few and far between. So the major events are Vader attacks, people are on the run. So we have Han and Leia are running away, and we have Luke go to Yoda. The next big plot event is when Darth Vader shows up at Cloud City and is like, surprise, and captures them, and then that sets in motion the very final act where Luke has to go confront Vader. So there's really not a lot of plot points. It's a lot of little events, little small events. But that's fine. We push that out of the way in order to make room for more character drama. And if we'd had lots of plot events where the characters are constantly have to obsess over what they're doing next, you wouldn't have as much time for, say, Han and Leia to be talking and having moments while they're hiding in an asteroid. There is a little bit of incongruity of time between Luke's story and Han's. Because if we just watch Luke's story, we get the impression that Luke is really doing this for a long time. If we just watch Han and Leia's story, we don't get the impression that they're running away from the Empire for a long time. It's like maybe they're running away for a couple days, maybe a week or two, I don't know, but not long enough for Luke to really have done all the training that you see, where he goes from not knowing anything to being able to like balance on one hand and move rocks and like do flips and have this test in like the dark side cave or whatever you want to call it. So there's a strong incongruity there, which I think has become an excuse of fans of the newer movies to, when you say like, well, Rey hasn't received any training. It's like, well, Luke only trained with Yoda for like 2 days. It's like, I really got the impression if you just watch Yoda's thing that he was there for like months, but again, there's an incongruity between the time that it takes to deliver both of those and the way that they're cut in between like that. So we're not really sure what's lining up with what and for how long he's there. The middle act is focused entirely on character drama. That's not a bad thing. But it just means that there's not a lot of plot events. There's a couple of little plot events with Han and Leia walking away, and otherwise it's conversations with Yoda. So the entire movie, I mentioned this represents a middle act in the trio. Heroes are going to be reactive, not proactive. The villain is going to take initiative. This is why I call this Darth Vader's movie. It's really him executing his plans and everybody else reacting to them. There's also chaos in the primary quest. We don't know how we're going to overcome the Empire. We're not sure how we're going to attain victory. We're trying to find those. And of course, it's going to end with a failure. So the hero's decision is the wrong one, and he must reassess what he's doing. This is really typical to close a second act and move into the third act. And then it's going to set up a new approach for the final movie. What are they going to do for the final movie? So overall, I give the plot a 7 out of 10, which that's an average score to me. It's not a great plot, but it's certainly not a bad plot. It's very serviceable. And the main thing is it puts the characters in the right places to have that drama that we really enjoy from them. So the story total, 8.5 out of 10. That's a good score, by the way. Let's move on. Let's talk just some general effects stuff before we close out this rather long presentation. So again, contrast has the strongest effect on the senses, and this movie uses it to great effect. Contrast in sound, contrast in light, contrast between scenes, contrast within scenes, and contrast within between character modes and drama. There's a high amount of character drama. It really is like space opera, or what George Lucas would say, soap opera, and it's what makes the movie feel as impactful as it does. The characters really matter, and it's the least changed by the special editions. I mentioned that, and it might have been the closest to Lucas's vision. As a result, I don't know, unless I was to talk to George Lucas about it. It felt the most like Star Wars. So this is one, it's hard to say. When people say something feels right, this is the one that feels right. They say, man, it looked so real. It felt so real. It feels like Star Wars, and that's why it's one of the most imitated afterwards. So the aesthetics are the most heavily referenced in theme parks and derivative works, such as games. So when you're playing games, you see a lot of hallways that look like that. In Rogue One, they had hallways that looked like they were from Cloud City and stuff. So it's all referenced for good reason. So overall, 9.5 out of 10. Final thoughts? It's usually thought of as the best or the favorite, and I think there's good reasons for that, as I've shown. It was not particularly loved by critics at the time, but time changes everything. I think people didn't quite know what to expect with this and didn't quite know what to do with this rather downer story at the end. I mentioned it's the least changed, and it maintains its impressions with heightened fidelity. Let me explain this. So in some of these movies, particularly the first one, if you watch it in really high fidelity, like 4K, you'll notice a lot of shortcomings with the set. You'll notice cheap things. You'll notice details that weren't intended to be really noticed from the first go around. In this one, because of the photography style and because of the extra attention to the set details, all of those details hold up. All those impressions still hold up. It never looks cheap or plasticky ever. So overall, it's a 9.3 out of 10. That's an A. That's a great movie, guys. So thanks so much for watching. I really, really, really do appreciate your time and your attention to this. Let me know what you think about Empire Strikes Back down below in the comment sections, and any agreements or disagreements you have about what I said here, or maybe where your score might be different and where you might place it relative to other things. I do have a couple of books that are out. So newest book that is out is City of Silver. This came out November 1st. This is a high fan. I call this 310 to Yuma, but fantasy. It's a high fantasy adventure. First part of the Moonsong series, which will be continuing next year. I have a book that's coming out Friday the 13th, so maybe when you're watching this. It's called Eyes in the Wall. It's a horror book, so check that out. Link is down below. And finally, if you're watching in December 2019, this is the only month you can get the Fantasy Christmas Spectacular, which is a giant volume of like 10 of my published books, all in one gigantic thing. So you can get all my books at once. I think it's $20, $20.19 for the paperback, which is huge. It's the biggest one that I could make. And then I think it's $10 for the ebook. So good value there, hopefully. Thanks so much, and I'll see you guys next time.